Welcome to the World War II project. I'm Kim Monson. I am thrilled to have in studio with me my good friend, and that is Kim Kimball. Kim, it's just great to have you in studio.
Thanks, it's good to be here.
So we want to hear your story. I know that we've talked about it before, but I think it's time to hear it again. So tell us, where did you grow up?
Well, first let me give you a disclaimer. At my age, memory sometimes plays tricks on you. So if I take a little poetic license with the truth occasionally, it's because of bad memory and nothing else.
Nothing else, okay. Okay, well now that we have the disclaimer out there, that's great.
Well, you know, the battles get a little more fierce every year, and girls get prettier. And
that's how it works, huh? Okay, great. Well, Kim Kimball, where did you grow up? Where did it all start?
I grew up in Oklahoma. I joined the Navy in 1944 when I was just barely 17, and I spent almost 3 years as an enlisted man, a radarman. I worked my way up to radarman second class. About 18 months of it on the Hornet, USS Hornet, and the balance in training and on the USS President Hayes, which was an attack troop transport that made most of the landings in the Pacific in World War II. I got discharged in Shoemaker, California, and promptly started into college at Oklahoma A&M University. Then it's now called Oklahoma State. And I put 4 years in there, graduated with a degree in electrical engineering. Went to work for a company called Alice Chalmers, which was one of the 40th largest in the world at that time. And in the meantime, I got a commission in the Reserve Officer Candidate School and got recalled in the Korean War, and spent about another 3 years as engineering officer on destroyer escorts. So all in all, I put in close to 6 years active duty and about 21 in the reserve.
Well, thank you for all that service.
Thank you.
Really, really appreciate that. You know, somebody said to me the other day that we sit in the shade because somebody else planted a tree, and I was thinking about you guys, and that is that I live in freedom because other people were able to put their lives on, they were willing to put their lives on the line for us, and greatly, greatly appreciate it. So how did you get into the Navy in 1944 when you just were 17 years old? How did that happen?
Well, they were taking 17-year-olds then, and my father was in World War I, and he okayed it. I had to get his approval to go in. And I didn't graduate from high school. In fact, I didn't go the senior year because all the young men were going to war, and it was so popular. And the superintendent of the little school I went to said that any boy who wanted to join before he graduated, he would see that we got a degree. So we did, and I was very ill prepared to go to college. I really struggled the first year because I missed all that senior year. Mm-hmm. Algebra and chemistry and whatever they were teaching back then.
Mm-hmm. So, and where did you fall in your family, siblings?
I have one sister. She's 2.5 years younger than I am.
Okay.
And still in good health.
Great. So you're 17 years old. What did your mom think about you going into the Navy?
She wasn't very happy.
I bet she wasn't. I bet she wasn't very happy with your dad either, huh?
No, in fact, I think he sang "Strangers in the Night" for quite a while after that.
I bet he did. But you're 17 years old, and why the Navy? An Oklahoma kid, why the Navy?
I was always fascinated with ships and the ocean. I'd never seen the ocean, but I just had a passion from the time I was, I guess, 9 or 8 years old to go in the Navy.
And once you're in the Navy, what happened? Where did you go for basic training?
San Diego. That was my first time really away from home. So a bunch of us, there must have been 50 or 60 Oklahoma clodhopper kids. They herded us on a train, and we were 3 days traveling from Oklahoma City to San Diego, and I'll never forget the first view of the ocean. It was from the train tracks going from LA down to San Diego, and it just took our breath away. We couldn't believe it. And I went through boot camp there, which was, I thought, pretty interesting. A lot of kids didn't like it, but I'm a great believer in some kind of military training or government service. In fact, if I was president, every kid in the country, boy or girl, would do at least 2 years of some kind of government service, Peace Corps or military. But
And why is that? Why do you think that's important?
Well, today we're not teaching discipline. We're not teaching respect. We're giving everybody an idea of, hey, why do you have to work? Well, you can go on welfare and make $6,000 a month.
Mm-hmm.
And the military and the other services will teach you that cooperation is one of the greatest factors that we have going, and everybody's got to have a boss. And so many kids today don't know there is such a thing as a
Mm-hmm.
boss.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was very good training, and it molded me in a lot of ways that I'd never had before.
Okay, anything in particular you'd like to share about boot camp?
To me, it was fun. It was physical. It was in the best shape physically of my life because we did a lot of calisthenics, and it was learning technical, even for a low-class seaman second, you learned how a steam plant worked, and you learned sailor jargon and the basics of being a bosun or a sailor, and it was an awful lot of fun. Besides, you were with a lot of other guys that were pretty well attuned to what you were, and you made a lot of friends.
Uh-huh. That reminds me, I don't know if I can pull this joke up in my mind, but I'm from Kansas, so hardworking people. I say that we work as a hobby, and so here you guys are from Oklahoma, and you're at boot camp, and you're the first guy that said it's a lot of fun. Reminds me of the letter that somebody sent home regarding boot camp, that we get up at 5 and we do the calisthenics and we work all day, and it's kind of like a vacation.
You're absolutely right, and I've always had respect for people from Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, the Midwest. It seems like those are the only people left anymore that you can shake hands with and you got a contract. You don't need to sign anything.
Mm-hmm.
It'll get done.
Mm-hmm. That's for sure. Yeah, salt of the earth. I totally agree on that. So boot camp, you're done with boot camp. What happens after that, Kim Kimball?
I got assigned to radar school, Point Loma and San Diego. It's a beautiful spit that goes out alongside the entrance to San Diego Harbor. Mm-hmm. And I spent, I think it was 4 or 5 months there learning how to operate the early radar we had at that time, which was just in the beginning. The radar is so much more sophisticated today, but we were able to pick up enemy planes up to 400 miles out on some good days, and these machines were so large it took 3 people to operate one from a console.
So, and that was just as radar was starting to develop, was near
Right.
the end of World War II.
Yeah.
Did this give us a leg up on the Japanese?
Oh, tremendously. The Japanese had nothing like it in the beginning, and we were able to spot them at night and pinpoint their location within 100 feet or so, and they didn't even know we were coming half the time. So it was one of the big things, I think, that helped us win the war. Was, we didn't invent it. The British actually invented it, and we took it and improved it a great deal. But we were able to, at the last, to get a radar that would give us altitude determining. We could tell how high a plane was when it was coming in, and that made a big difference in the fighters when they went out to see if they couldn't do a little damage to the Zeros.
And And that probably really was an important component. Now, are we getting near the end of the war in the Pacific, or tell me exactly where we are there?
We were pretty close to the end. The major battles were the Battle of Midway and the Battle of the Coral Sea. Those were some of the big battles that proved the aircraft carrier was here to stay. The battleship was absolutely, well, not totally useless, but it was regulated to a minor shore bombardment capacity. And that's one mistake the Japanese made. They put a lot of their resources into battleships, which turned out to be totally useless in trying to fight a bunch of airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
So it was along toward the end, the liberation of Guam, the Tinian, were some of the last islands that we took. And after the war, we were actually in San Francisco when VJ Day occurred. We had we went through a terrible typhoon. The Third Fleet did. In fact, we lost, I think, 4 destroyers because they were low on fuel and they had not ballasted with salt water in the fuel tanks, so they rode very high in the water, and it made them very unstable. And when they hit these 30 and 40 and 60-foot waves, 4 of them, I believe, actually capsized and were lost. We took water over the hangar deck, which was 60 foot off the ocean, and it stove in the first 50 foot of our hangar deck, and we had to go back to, well, Pearl Harbor didn't have a place to repair it, so we had to go back to San Francisco to Hunters Point for repairs, and we were there loading for the Japanese invasion, and we loaded week after week of a tremendous amount of supplies and bringing the air group on board.
And was this on a carrier at that time? Was this on a carrier or?
Yeah, on the carrier, yeah. And on VJ Day, I was a third-class petty officer, and I unfortunately caught shore patrol duty. Everybody was going to have such a big party that a lot of us were conscripted into becoming shore patrol, and they told us, they said, don't bother anybody unless it's obvious rape or murder.
Oh.
And it was quite a show. I'll never forget it. It was a lot of happy people.
Yeah. Well, so let's go back just a little bit, though. I want to hear more about this typhoon because I hadn't really thought about it. I've learned so much in talking with you guys as World War II veterans that there were decisions to go through typhoons, and hadn't really thought about just how dangerous that was. These ships that were capsized. I mean, the guys were lost, or did you?
Yeah, they were. A lot of them were rescued, but we lost an awful lot of them because it was really a mistake on the captain's part. It was his decision as to whether, when you ballast a fuel tank with salt water, you give the ship much more stability, and it's able to take waves and to roll much more than it would be if you were had a very high center of gravity and you're floating on top. And the captain has to make a decision: do I want to take the risk? Because if I put salt water in the fuel tanks, they have to be completely cleaned, and that's quite a job. It takes steam and hot water, and it's a really messy, terrible job before you can put fuel back in them, because you don't dare send salt water to your boilers. So they made the decision based, I guess, on, I don't know, on the weather report, that it wouldn't be as bad as it was, but it caught a lot of them in a situation where they just couldn't get out of.
And what, it's just waves and wind and
waves
water?
And wind, very, very high waves. Well, we took waves over the hangar deck, over the flight deck, which we were 60 foot off the water. And that was when the nose would dip down. But the carrier then was a huge ship. Today it's like a rowboat compared to modern carriers.
Mhm.
We had about 3,000 people on board, and today's carriers hold 5,000 or more.
Mhm.
But they're made in sections, actually. Ours was made in 3 sections, and they had expansion joints. And when you stand in the back of the hangar deck and look forward when you're going into high seas, you could see the front part move up and down, and then the middle part move up and down, and then you'd feel it on the back part.
Man.
And it was designed that way to help take care of heavy seas.
Okay. So never went through your mind that it might break apart then.
Well, I was never going to die at that time.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a good thing. That is a good thing. Let's go back just a little bit. You mentioned Midway and Coral Sea. Now that was you were probably just, what, 12 or 13
Well,
during those battles were.
a lot of the action that the carriers saw, all the carriers, whenever they'd make a landing or go in support of a landing on an island or someplace, the carriers were usually 10 to 30 miles offshore, and they let the aircraft do the fighting for them.
Mm-hmm.
The aircraft would take off and go in and bomb and strafe and whatever, come back, land, refuel, and go back out. So they didn't see an awful lot of battle damage from destroyers and cruisers of the enemy. There were some of the big battles.
Mm-hmm.
They did, yeah, where everybody messed it up with
Mm-hmm.
all types of ships. But for the most part, the carriers were not close to a real battle scene, not like if you're on an LST or a troop
Mm-hmm.
transport where you're a mile or so off and everybody's shooting at you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, well, you know what, Kim, let's go to break. This is Kim Monson. I'm talking with Kim Kimball, World War II veteran. He obviously served on the USS Hornet, and learning about his experience in the Pacific Theater in World War II. So we will be right back. Thank you, William.
Well,
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Welcome back to the World War II Project. I'm Kim Monson. I'm talking with Kim Kimball, my friend, World War II veteran, and talked about how you got into the Navy in 1944. You were just barely 17 years old. Your father signed for you to get in. He was World War I veteran. But you're now in the Pacific, and we've been talking a bit about you've gone through a typhoon. I wanted to go back a little bit to these aircraft carriers and just what an interesting phenomenon it is, because many of us, if we've been out to California, maybe we've toured an aircraft carrier, and the aircraft carriers of World War II were much smaller than what we see today. So it was quite a feat to be sending this aircraft off and then seeing them come back. First of all, what was it like when you saw these planes going off to battle?
Well, first of all, we didn't have jets. We were before the Jet A. They came into service after the war. We had SP-2Cs, which were a dive bomber. We had TBMs, which was also a dive bomber. That's one the president flew. He was in World War II. The first, I can't think of his name right now. President Bush, yeah.
Okay.
The first President Bush flew one.
Mm-hmm.
And we had F-4Us, which were the gull wing, and to my thinking, the most beautiful airplane that was ever built. It's a gull wing fighter, and was an excellent airplane. And we had F-6Fs and F-4Fs, which were Grumman's. They were more like 8 machine guns and a seat and a big engine. They were small, but they were deadly, and they could stand up to the Zeros pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had some other auxiliary type aircraft, but these were all engine driven. tricycle.
And how many guys on those? If you had 8 machine guns, how many guys on one
Usually
of those?
the fighters just one, but with the SP2Cs had 2. They had a gunner and a bombardier and a pilot. I think the one that Bush flew was just one man.
Okay.
Most of them were one pilot, and that was it.
So you have to fly and
Fly
be able to
and shoot and bomb and everything else.
Yeah.
Try to get out of the way.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was really exciting again for a 17-year-old because the aircraft landing was not as perfected as it is today. We had, for example, a straight flight deck, and now they're all cantered. So whenever a plane comes in and when you're landing a lot in a big hurry, which sometimes you had to do, they would stack them on the front of the ship on the flight deck, and the planes coming in for landings to the rear of the ship, if they didn't make a proper landing or catch a cable, they ran the danger of running right into those, which could cause a real catastrophe. But now with the canted decks, they're off to the side when they land, so if they miss a cable or don't land right, they just go on around and come around again. It's a lot safer now. It's not much fun still, but it's a lot safer now than it was back then. And the cables were about 6 inches off the deck. They could be raised by some levers when a plane was coming in. And they were low enough to the deck that the wheels would run over them, but the cable hook on the rear of the plane would hopefully catch one of them. And if it didn't catch, and there was a lot of times it didn't, they had 3 big barriers that they raised, and these stretched all the way across the flight deck, and they were inch-thick steel cables, 2 of them, and the plane would run into those to stop, to keep it from going into the parked planes in front. So that would tear up the plane pretty good.
Yeah.
And most of the propellers then were large, 8 to 10 foot in diameter with laminations, so they would splinter, and shrapnel would just fly all over the deck. So usually they wouldn't let you on the deck when a plane was coming in for a landing. You had to stay down below, or if you were in the island. At that point, I worked in what was called a CIC, Combat Information Center, where all the radar was located, and where we vectored the planes out for their runs on islands or to fight, and took care of incoming enemy planes. And it was a very active, fairly small room with about 40 people in it, and all of them bent over scopes and radar scopes and charts and graphs. And again, extremely exciting for a 17-year-old. But that was located in the island, which is the part of the ship on the side where the bridge is located, where they con the ship from. And so I got to see a lot of the action of landing and takeoff, because we could step outside. We were on the 3rd deck up, and we had a real good view of the flight deck.
Going back to early in World War II, Jimmy Doolittle, they took what, B-25s off?
B-25s off the first Hornet, yeah.
Off the first Hornet.
Yeah, that was the Hornet that was sunk, and I think it was the Battle of Coral Sea. And the ship I was on was originally going to be named the Kearsarge, and she was just about to be launched when the first Hornet was sunk, and they, in tribute to the first Hornet, they turned around and named this one the Hornet too.
Okay. I'm trying to think of the quote of Admiral Nimitz, that how are ships like women, it takes a lot of time to keep them in paint and makeup or something like that.
Well, that and Admiral Tojo, he said after they bombed Pearl Harbor, I'll never forget his famous quote, because all of his officers were laughing and drinking sake, and they asked him how he felt. He said, "I don't think it's a victory. I think we've just awakened a sleeping giant."
I remember
He
hearing
was
that.
so right.
He was absolutely so right. And we were lucky at Pearl Harbor
Yes, we were.
because the aircraft carriers, most of them were out
They
to
were
sea,
out
right?
at sea,
Yeah.
right, every one of them. It's just
Yeah.
the big battleships and the cruisers that hit the most of it there.
Yeah, so, okay, so you're a young 17-year-old kid, you're on the USS Hornet. What's some of the stories of the Hornet? Tell us about that.
Well, I try to remember the good things, things that were funny, and I remember I had to sit as a telephone talker on the bridge, and we had communications by speakerphone to and from the CIC to the bridge, but we also had a telephone talker up there as a backup, just in case you needed communications and your other electronic communication got shot away. So we had to periodically serve as a messenger or telephone talker. And I remember two cases. One was that we had after I'd been on board maybe 3 or 4 months and was a seasoned sailor, we had a young boot that was serving as a messenger, and they decided to play a trick on him. It was on a night watch, so they told him, the junior officer deck, said, go down to the music locker and bring us the F key to the bugle. And he didn't know. He took off for the music locker, and he got down there, and they told him, well, it's way back on the fantail. You got to go to this other place. And they kept the poor guy running for an hour before he found out he was getting his chain jerked.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember after BJ Day hit, we spent another 3 weeks offloading all these supplies, a lot of them that we had loaded on board. We offloaded all the airplanes and all the air group, and they welded 8,000 bunks on the hangar deck, and went down to a skeleton crew. Normally we had 3,000 in the crew. We were down to about 600 in the skeleton crew. And we turned the unused bunks on the ship and these new bunks they had welded on the hangar deck into a troop transport. And we made 5 trips to and from the various islands, back to Seattle or San Francisco, bringing troops back. We brought back about 12,000 at a time. And those bunks were 8 high, and they didn't have anything to do all day but sit around and play cards. They got 2 meals a day, and they were, I was amazed because with all the boredom, and it was a good 3-week trip, I never heard one complaint, not one. They were so happy to be going home. But whenever we make a trip out, it was really boring because there was only a few of us on board, and we didn't have much to do, and morale was not as high as it should be. And we left Seattle one day. We left on December 23rd to go back. We had to spend Christmas on the way out, and everybody was they weren't exactly happy. But the skipper at that time was a man named C.R. Brown. He became admiral, I believe, of the Mediterranean fleet afterwards, and he had a good sense of humor. I was in port. I was a jeep driver. We had 6 jeeps on board, and we had 6 drivers, and they were there to take the officers and the various chiefs around to get supplies and to and from the airports when the pilots were getting their training in. Well, I drove the captain around quite a bit, and he was a nice guy. But one trip going out on the bridge, they were on the bridge at night, and the junior officer of the deck got a phone call, and he kind of looked puzzled, and he said, "Where?" And he hung up the phone, and he turned to the officer of the deck, and he said, "That was a funny call. The guy just said the Phantom Pooper strikes again," and I'm using poop. It's a little bit of an acronym here. And he said, "Right outside the captain's door." And sure enough, they sent a Marine down, and here was a little paper sack full of full of something that shouldn't have been there. And of course the word got out on the grapevine immediately. By the next morning, everybody wanted to know who the Phantom Hooper was. And every night after that, for a week or so, he would leave a little bag of remembrance at some part of the ship and call the bridge. And they never did find out who he was, but it really improved the morale of the ship. And I often thought in some of my discussions with when I was driving Brown around, that he actually put the people up to doing that, just to improve the morale. But it did.
So you think the captain was behind the Phantom
It gave us
Hooper?
something to focus on.
Yeah, other than being bored. What about Kim Kimball bringing these guys back? You said it's a 3-week trip, not one of them complained. I mean, they were pretty battle worn by that time, weren't they?
A lot of them were, yeah. A lot of them we picked up off of Guam. We pulled into Guam about 3 days after it was secured, and it was pretty bad. There were some like 15,000, I think, Japanese troops had committed suicide by jumping off the cliffs or killed by our advancing forces, and they were just laying around. And 3 days in Guam laying around, and it gets pretty bad. And it's kind of strange. They finally buried them all in an open pit grave. I didn't get off the ship at that time, but years ago, in fact, it's only been about 15 years ago, I'm an engineer, and I went over to Guam to put on a flow meter school for the Guam Power Authority and the Navy base. And I went back out to the base one day just to look around, and I went in the officers club to have a beer, and I was sitting there talking to the bartender, and I'd driven by the graveyard for these Japanese soldiers, and they had turned it into a golf course. And I told him, I said, why did you guys do that? It seems a little sacrilegious and not a very good thing to do. And the bartender laughed, and he said, well, about 15 years ago, the Japanese came over and dug them all up and took them back to Japan.
Okay.
So they respected their dead just as we did.
Yeah. So Guam, were you, refresh my listeners' memories, then how those battles went. There was Guam, and then what was after that?
Gosh, my memory is hazy too.
Was there like Tinian and Saipan?
Well, Tinian, they were all grouped together there. They're all in the Marianas, and there were one right after another. We made a couple of trips to Saipan and Tinian, bringing back troops, and there were still a lot of Japanese in the jungles that hadn't given up, and we were warned not to go off the roads at all, not even 10 foot into the jungle. We were just getting shot because there were so many holdouts that wouldn't believe that Japan had surrendered.
What about Okinawa? Where were you for the Battle of Okinawa?
No, I wasn't in that, but I remember on Guam, when we pulled in there, we had a lot of beer on board. It was Valentine's ale, and we couldn't drink on the ship, but the skipper, we were over there one Sunday, anchored off, and this was on Tinian, I guess, or Saipan. The skipper had a barge pulled up alongside the ship, and he declared that an island, and he moved the beer off onto the barge and let us off on the barge, a third of the ship at a time, or whatever it would hold. We got 2 or 3 beers, and they were all flat. No carbonation, but we didn't care.
And that was on that island that was right next to
That was the island that he created so that we could legally do that. And then we had lost a Jeep. One of our Jeep drivers, I don't know, he didn't tie down his Jeep right, and it rolled overboard. So a crew went aboard one night to the officers club on Guam and liberated a Jeep from the parking lot.
Oh, did they?
And drove it back and loaded it on LCVP that they had commandeered and hauled it out to the ship. And 4 hours later, they had it repainted, new stripes on it, new license numbers. It became a part of the ship's company.
Did anything ever happen?
No, nothing ever happened. I often wonder what those officers must have thought when they couldn't find their chief.
Oh my gosh! You know, you've touched on a couple of things there that I think would be key for maybe our listeners. And actually, it's interesting, Kim. I'm trying to think who I was talking to. Oh, one of my sponsors, Karen Levine, who is a sponsor of this show. She's with Remax Alliance. Another thing that she does is she teaches kids at her church, and many of them, I guess, are listening to this show to learn their history about World War II. So that just absolutely warms my heart. But you mentioned, when we talk about the Phantom Pooper, and also about this island that's been created, starts to make me think about leadership and morale. And so you've been around a lot of different folks, in your experiences on that. So we're going to go to break. When we come back, I'd like to hear what you have to say about good leadership, because you certainly have probably seen that in your experience in the Navy. So this is Kim Monson. I'm talking with World War II veteran Kim Kimball, and we'll be right back. That Phantom Pooper story is
it was amazing.
too funny.
I was dying because I was trying not to laugh so loud that you could hear me, but
That's awesome.
Well, I really think I remember I was driving him back from a party in San Francisco, and I asked him who he thought the Phantom Pooper was, and he just raised an eyebrow and smiled. He said, "We'll probably never know."
Okay, so we could probably touch on Korea as well. Do you want to talk at all about Korea, or?
Yeah, I didn't see a whole lot of duty in Korea. Most of mine was in the Mediterranean, and well, we can talk about it. Yeah,
Okay.
I had some good experiences there. I learned an awful lot
Okay.
in Korea. That was another almost 3 years.
Okay. So I'd like to have you talk about leadership, because
Okay.
I think in your life, I think you understand that. Any other stories we want to make sure that we talk about in World War II?
No, I can't think of any right now. My memory is hazy, and the battles get more fierce, and the girls get prettier.
I love it. Okay, so Charlie, you ready?
Rolling. Yep.
Okay. Welcome back to the World War II Project with Kim Monson. I am talking with World War II and Korean War veteran Kim Kimball. And before we went to break, Kim, you worked with it sounds like some guys that were really leaders. What would you tell our listeners about what you think makes a good leader?
Well, I think first of all, he has to gain the respect of the people he's trying to lead, and I think you do that mostly by letting those folks know that you really care about them. You're not just there to show some shiny bars and strut around. You really are interested in their lives and in what they want to do, and helping them with their careers and training them. I knew a lot of officers that were wonderful leaders. I've known some that were pretty poor,
Mm-hmm.
but most of them were on a first name basis with the enlisted men they led, and even when you were off duty and off the ship, you weren't formal. You could drink beer together and tell jokes together, and you become more or less one of the group.
Mm-hmm.
But again, gaining the respect of the people you work for, and you can only do that if you can make good decisions. If you make bad ones,
Mm-hmm.
it's not only bad for you, it's bad for them. And a lot of officers made a lot of bad decisions, but thank goodness we made more good decisions than bad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that I've heard from many of the guys that served with Patton is that they felt that he would not ask them to do anything that he wouldn't do.
Exactly. Yeah, he felt that way, and I think all of his men, and he had literally hundreds of thousands of under him, felt pretty much the same way. When they'd see him out there in the mud, knee deep in the mud, directing traffic at a crossroads in France, a general, and he did that. That gained him an awful lot of respect. And he was actually one of the most brilliant generals I think that we've ever produced. He was pretty much said what he thought, and it got him in trouble a lot of time. But he got a lot of things done. He's sort of like a president we got today.
You always know where they stand.
Yeah.
You know, that reminds me a story that I heard about George Washington, that some guys were trying to get, I think, a log up, you know, onto a armament or a barrier or something, and there was a commanding officer that continued to encourage them to push, and I guess Washington had his cloak on, and he gets off his horse and he helps them. They needed just one more man to push it up, and he looked at the officer and he said, "Well, why didn't you do that?" And he said, "Well, I'm an officer," and Washington takes off his cloak and he says, "Well, I'm the general," and so, you know, I think that
That's a good example.
yeah, it's a good example. In your life, you probably have come across a lot of, as you mentioned, good leaders and bad leaders, or not so good leaders. And I think sometimes you also learn from some of the guys that are not great leaders. I think you can learn from that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so.
You can.
Any other stories from World War II before we go on and talk about what you did during the Korean War?
Not that, not particularly to think about or talk about. There was a lot of boredom. There always is, and when you're in the service, no matter what service you're in. And there were some memorable moments, but I think VJ Day was one of my biggest memories. To see the joy in this country, and I remember a lot of vivid memories of crashes on the planes coming in for landing, and luckily we never lost a pilot when I was on board, but we went through a lot of crashes. We had the first group of F-8F fighters. These were Grumman fighters, and they didn't see any combat. They came on the scene after just at the end of the war, and they were much more powerful than the F-6F. They were a huge engine, and
Again, they were still prop?
they were prop planes.
Yeah, okay.
We didn't have any jets at all. But we got the first squadron of 8. We were off San Francisco, and they came in for their very first carrier landings. They'd been making carrier landings, practiced on land, but out of the 12, and there was 12, not 8. 8 of them went into the barriers. They were so hot to land. And they had not really, the pilots hadn't really gained the complete control of what was happening to the plane when they came in. And I'll never forget that day, because it was just shrapnel everywhere. We didn't hurt anybody. We sure tore up a lot of government equipment, but
So 8 of them crashed out of 12 in one
eight
day?
of them crashed into the barriers on the first. They missed the tail hooks, and I think they probably did some design changes after that.
You think? Yeah, I would think so. But you said fortunately you never lost a pilot. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is. It's considering some of the crashes they went through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So after VJ Day, then you went back to college. Is that your timeline?
After I got off the Hornet because after we did our Magic Carpet runs, this was called the Magic Carpet Fleet, bringing all these troops back. They were going to put the Hornet out of commission, and they said, "We're going to assign you guys that were radarmen. We're going to put you down, and you'll be chipping bilges to get painted, to get it cleaned up for decommissioning." And I thought, well, I don't particularly want to do that, so I wanted to see the atomic bomb go off. I had a real desire, and this was the time when Operation Bikini was that's when they dropped all those A-bombs in the harbor at Bikini back when they were allowed to do testing, and we actually dropped, I think, the first hydrogen bomb there.
Okay.
And I wanted to see that, so I signed up for Operation Bikini, and they put me on the President Hayes, which at that time they had turned into a supply ship taking supplies to and from Bikini and taking personnel to and from Hawaii. It's a stop we'd make. So we made a number of runs out there in that duty, and that was again a skeleton crew. We only had 4 men in the radar section, which meant that you were just one man operating all the radars for a 4-hour stint. And
was the Hayes also an aircraft carrier?
no, Hayes was a troop transport. They converted it into a supply transport.
Okay.
And it was a former luxury liner, a lure line, I think, and it had staterooms, so we were lucky when we go out and there were no troops on board, we all had a stateroom, and that was unheard of
Sure.
for a enlisted man. And then we took a lot of nurses, and we took military families out and back. But I never did get to see a bomb go off. We were always a day away when they dropped one.
Huh. Now, you're the first person that I've talked to that have said, A, that they wanted to see an atomic bomb go off, and B, that they actually got close to one.
Yeah, we were pretty close, but we still were too far away.
Too far away to do that. Okay. Okay, well, that's fascinating, Kim. So after this, then what happened?
I went to
You're
college, and I got out of the service and immediately enrolled in college with this Fox high school diploma I had,
Mm-hmm.
which was acceptable. And the first year was pretty rough. I remember it because I just didn't have the prerequisites to really go to college. But after that, it became pretty easy, and I went 4 years, and then went to work for Alice Chalmers and was with them for over 20 years.
Mm-hmm. During the Korean War, what did you do then?
The Korean War, in college, I got a commission. I stayed in the reserve and wanted to go ahead and get my commission, so I got a commission as an ensign. And as soon as I went to work for Alice Chalmers, I immediately got recalled to duty in the Korean War. And I was assigned to the USS Lanning, which was a destroyer escort hull, but they had converted it into a high-speed attack transport. We carried frogmen, which are now, we call them SEAL teams. But we carried about 70 or 80 frogmen, and our job was to go into a beach and drop them off in rubber boats and let them go in and blow up things, and then we'd make a run back down the beach at a pre-assigned time and pick them up from their rubber rafts. And I got transferred after about a year to the USS Cronin, which was a destroyer escort control, and its job was to, whenever you had an invasion of an island, you had a thing called an LOD, a line of departure. And this was where the landing boats would line up in a line formation a mile or two from the beach, and on signal, all of them would go in at once. You wanted all of them to hit, so the enemy would see a wall of fire there instead of just 1 or 2 ships. And the control destroyer escort sat on the end of that line and got everybody lined up and gave the order to go ahead. And it was not a very pleasant place to be because you're anchored out there all alone and a perfect target for anybody to shoot at you. Luckily, we didn't have any of that because the landings in Korea were not like the ones in the Pacific. They weren't near as drastic. And it's kind of interesting. The Cronin was named after a helmsman. I think it was on the USS Maine which was Admiral Dewey's flagship when he sailed into Manila Bay in the Battle of the Philippines before World War I. And you know, his famous slogan was "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead."
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Cronin family donated a silver tea service to the wardroom, and we met some of them. And one of the Cronins was a very jovial man, and he said, "That's not what Admiral Dewey said. What we were told by the helmsman was, he said, 'Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead.'"
The inflection really makes a difference, doesn't it?
So, yeah, you're right. It's how you say it.
Yeah. So when you were doing this, where were you located then?
We were mostly out of Norfolk, Virginia, and Newport News, and some out of San Francisco.
But where were the frogmen making these runs? Where were you dropping them off at?
Well, we really didn't. We never made a landing in the Korean War using frogmen. We did a lot of training with them.
Okay.
Out of San Diego, out of I've forgotten the name of the base now. It's on North Island,
Okay.
and it's still the primary SEAL team base.
Okay.
But they were a rough bunch. Boy, I wouldn't want to tackle with them.
I think that's still the case, isn't
It
it?
is.
Yeah. Okay. And so this primarily during the Korean War, then it would be training that you
Training and show the flag, and I put her out of commission in Green Cove Springs, Florida, when we decommissioned the ship, and I think it was '53 at the end of the Korean War.
Okay.
And we spent 3 months down there blowing out all the lines and drying out the ship and preserving it so it, if it ever needed again, it could be recalled very easy.
Okay.
And there were something like 800 destroyer escorts made during World War II, and about 300 were tied up down at the Green Cove Springs. And they never called them back to duty. The Cronin now is a reef, a barrier reef, sunk off of North Carolina for fish.
Huh.
So a lot of them were sunk for reefs, a lot of them were scrap metal. But, I don't think well, there's only one left, and that's the museum in Syracuse, New York,
Okay.
the USS Slater.
Huh. You know, I find all this just so fascinating, and I had the opportunity just recently to fly on a B-25, and Kim, I actually was surprised. I for some reason I thought that they were long, you know, they're teeny. They were made for young, nimble men, and I think that probably the boats were as well. I mean, you guys, you were flying and floating things that I find truly amazing.
Well, it's so different today. On the Hornet, I was in a room that was maybe 40 foot by 20 foot, and there were 80 of us slept in there. And the bunks were 4 high, and you were continually jabbing your shipmate in the eye with your toe, trying to get in and out of a bunk, and your lockers were tiny little things, and the restrooms they didn't have such things as commodes. Back then they had a trough that continually, they flushed salt water down it continually, and they had seats mounted on top of the trough, and no partitions, so you had no privacy. That used to be a favorite trick in the enlisted men's head of lighting a newspaper and getting up at the front end of that trough and dropping it lit so it would float down.
The things you did for entertainment, that's for sure. So, well, Kim Kimball, thank you. It's just been a great conversation. And just a quick question: when you see the American flag these days, what goes through your mind?
I have a great respect for it. I think two things that we're ignoring totally are the flag and the Constitution. And we're not going to be back to the country we should be until we start teaching history. And we don't teach it anymore. Japan's trying to rewrite it. They don't even talk about World War II. We have, somebody told me now that a lot of high schools have devoted 2 or 3 pages to World War I and World War II in their history books, and that's a crime. It really is.
It is.
Maybe the Jewish people were right. They've kept the Holocaust alive because they talk about it every year and they do something about it. Our young people don't know anything about it today.
Well, I think they're hungry for this knowledge, and that's one of the reasons why we do this show, is to capture these stories, because each story is individual and just fascinating. So, Kim Kimball, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So this is Kim Monson signing off. Stay tuned, same time, same place next week, and God bless you, and God bless America.
Perfect.
Got it? Oh,
Got it.
Charlie,
Cut,
you're the
cut,
best.
cut.
Cut. That's right. Well, thank you. We'll get you on the road just in time for
Yeah.
traffic.
Well, you know what? I can just put it in automatic
That's right.
and just sit back there and I don't have to worry.
Okay. So how will you get back up to the mountains?
Oh, I'll go in I-25 to 6th Avenue and then
And out
6th
that way,
Avenue to
okay.
I-70. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, tell Annabelle hello.
I will.
It was so good to see you. Thanks so much for doing this.
That was fun. Enjoyed it. And we've got to do lunch again.
That sounds good.
Yeah.